Hello, I'm Hummy from Hummy's World, and in this video we're going to be talking about what is exposure. It seems like all of the professional photographers constantly talk about exposure. Every other sentence seems to include the word exposure. And we're all supposed to get that right exposure, and it can be frustrating not really understanding the concept of what the word exposure means. And so that's what we're going to talk about in order to simplify it for you in this lesson. There are three factors of exposure. And that's what we're going to just outline quickly in this lesson. First factor that affects exposure is ISO. You will remember back in the days when you bought film for your cameras before digital cameras, you may recall some numbers of 100 and 200 on the boxes, and you were like, what is that? I know, I certainly did. This is the ISO. It is the film speed, and film speed is light sensitivity of film. Now we'll talk more about that when we have our lesson about ISO. The second thing that is a factor of exposure is aperture. Now, you've probably, if you've learned anything, tried to learn anything about photography, you've probably heard of f-stop and how confusing f-stop is. That is the term in photography that we use for aperture. Basically, aperture is controlled by the hole that is in your lens. That the bigger the hole, the more the light comes in the lens. So the smaller the hole, the less light comes in the lens. That is aperture. And the last one that is a factor in exposure is shutter speed. Shutter speed is how long light enters the camera. So if the shutter stays open longer, you're going to get more light in. As it opens and closes really fast, you're going to get less light in. And each one of these will be a separate lesson in more detail later. But these are the three factors that affect exposure. Now you notice I have in each one of these a word that is highlighted, that is a different color, that is involved in each one of these factors. Each one of these factors is all about light. And exposure is all about light. The whole thing is all about light. Photography is all about light. That is all you have to know about exposure. Is that everything about your camera and getting the right setting is all about light and how much light is getting into your camera. So now we have this funky word on our screen. It's the law of reciprocity. Okay, that's a very hard word. Reciprocity. I had to learn how to say it for this video, and I dare you to say it 10 times fast. Reciprocity, 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 reciprocity. Ah! Okay, let's just call it law of photography. What is the law of photography? It has to do with the same thing that we've been discussing regarding exposure and light. Reciprocity is a state of relation. Okay, I had to go to my dictionary and look up what reciprocity was because it's such an odd word. And this is the definition that they gave us: a state of relation. Objects that are reciprocal. Now that might be a word you're a little bit more familiar with, so I wanted to throw that in there. It's another form of reciprocity. Objects that are reciprocal are felt by each toward the other. So if one object does something, it is felt by the other object. The law of photography is the relationship between three factors to control light. There you have it, all rounded up. The law of reciprocity, or the law of photography, is the relationship between the three factors that control light. And we've already learned those three factors, which is ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. Now, the law of reciprocity, I have got to get through this tutorial and not say that word anymore. It's all scientific, mathematical stuff, and I don't know about you, but I was never real good at science, and I was good. I got good grades, but it was never my thing. Math was never my thing. So when it comes to cameras and I want to do my favorite hobby and get those photos that I so treasure, and then I want to learn more about my camera and you tell me it's about science and math, I go, I really don't want to learn science and math. We really don't have to learn science and math. But let me give you a quick overview of it so you can understand the math. Exposure is aperture plus shutter speed plus ISO. So there's that relationship. When you add or subtract from one of those, you have to add or subtract from one of the other ones. That is the simple math of exposure. It's that algebra we learned in school that we thought we would never ever use. I don't know about you, but I took a lot of algebra and I don't remember much of it, and I rarely use it anymore. But does this look familiar? Exposure is x equal y plus z. So if x is your aperture and you put two figures in for y and z, which is your shutter speed and ISO, then your aperture is going to have to be a certain setting. Or let's say you know the figures for your ISO and your aperture, then x would be your shutter speed, and that will be a definite figure that's going to work in your camera. So you have two of the figures, and the third one will have to be the right figure to get the right exposure. There you have it. Fortunately, we have digital cameras which are smart and do the math for us. Oh yeah. That's great. I love the dummy mode on my camera because it does all the smart work for me. I don't have to calculate anything. Or, as you're going to learn later, you can have it on some settings where it does part of the calculating for you and it lets you have a little fun with it. But then there's the full manual mode. And if you're in that full manual mode, there's still help. There are exposure calculators that are available, and you can get those online. You can get them in little printed cheat cards that you can carry with you. You can get them on cell phone apps. And so if you are brave and you're going to go out there in that full manual mode, there is help. Think of the law of reciprocity as a tug of war. You got a rope, and the rope is only one distance, and as you pull the rope one way, the other side is affected. You can't pull one way or the other without the other side being affected, and the rope never changes. It's always the same length, and this is the same with your law of reciprocity. Only you have not one long rope, but you have a rope that goes in three directions, and you have them pulling in three different directions. You have your ISO, your shutter speed, and your aperture. And if you make the ISO a larger figure, then what's going to happen to the shutter speed and the aperture? They're going to have to be adjusted down, because you can only get so much light in to get that good exposure. Or let's say you leave your shutter open longer and let in more light. What's going to have to happen to the ISO and the aperture? See, so they will be letting in less light. And the same thing with aperture. If you have that hole really big, what's going to happen to the other two factors? They're going to have to let in less light. And so hopefully this tug of war analogy will help you understand a little bit more about how your camera works and what we're going to be getting into. This basic understanding is necessary. All the math I don't think is really all that necessary. You can get as much into this as you want, or as little into it as you want, but to understand the basic concept is important. So in addition to ISO, aperture, and shutter speed, we will be learning other techniques which affect light, because exposure is all about light, including manual compensation, which is the histogram. Now, for some of you who know Photoshop or Photoshop Elements, you've seen that levels tool and the histogram there. There are histograms on your camera, and you can manually compensate by seeing the histogram. But we're going to learn exactly what the histogram does and how it shares with us how much light is reaching our camera. There's also metering modes and exposure lock. If there's one good tip I can give you, this is the one you're going to need to learn. So pay close attention when we get to that lesson. Bracket mode is when we shoot 3 exposures and only press down the shutter button once. And it takes 3 different types of exposures. And of course we'll get to that lesson. White balance is also important because there are other little factors in there other than ISO, aperture, and shutter speed, and one of the main ones is reflection and absorption properties, and that's going to come in play when we're setting the white balance. So here we are at the end of this What is Exposure lesson, and this is a photo of a bird I took on my recent vacation, and it's telling us to let's get started. And I'm ready to get started, and I hope you are too.